Welcome to Legally Speaking, a podcast from the Utah Attorney General's Office. Here, we will be discussing matters of policy and justice, cases that our office is taking on, hot topics in Utah and in the world, but of course, it will all be done legally speaking.
Hello, I'm Richard Pyatt from the Utah Attorney General's Office. Welcome to our podcast, Legally Speaking. And joining me today is Marlo Oaks, who is the State Treasurer for the state of Utah. The topic we're talking about is something you may have heard in the news here and there, but you may not understand. ESG, which stands for Environmental Social Governance. So, Treasurer Oaks, my definition of ESG, as they call it, is standards for a company's behavior used by socially conscious investors to screen investments.
Okay.
So is that an accurate term? Okay, so what does that mean?
Yeah, so essentially you have different firms that are rating companies, and they're rating them based on these different factors that underlie environment, social, or governance, kind of these broad categories, right? And so the idea is to try and help the market to understand what companies are doing in these different areas. The problem is that it becomes political very quickly because these are subjective factors that are chosen, and there is subjectivity related to what makes the right answer, what allows you to get a higher score. And the way I think about it, it really measures compliance to a political agenda. And I don't get into the underlying issues as much. In other words, the underlying politics. To me, the problem is the mechanism itself. ESG as a way of driving behavior in the marketplace. To me, that's where the problem is.
Okay, so our office is involved in a case against using ESG standards. So why is the state involved? Why does the state of Utah care whether investors are using this standard or not?
So, I've told people here in the state for a number of months that we have the best credit in the world. We've never been rated below the top credit rating by any of the three credit rating agencies that we've used. What that means is that we're able to borrow money at the lowest rates in the capital markets, which means it's cheaper for all of us in the state of Utah because we don't have to pay as high of a rate on the money that we borrow. So that's the credit rating I view as a key asset of this state because it allows us to borrow money at the lowest rates possible. When you introduce a metric like ESG, that potentially impacts our ability as a state to borrow capital in the capital markets. Because if you think about ESG, it adds a quantitative measure to things that are subjective. So it gives it a veneer of objectivity that really isn't there. And whoever is determining what the factors are underlying that rating can drive behavior. So, for example, one of the factors under the S part of ESG is often reputational risk.
Okay.
So the problem that I have with ESG had specifically to do with the credit rating agency that decided to give states ratings. They gave the state of Utah a rating, and it wasn't so much the rating itself this time around as much as it is the mechanism of the rating itself for future exercises, right, in this. So under the S part, the social part, one thing that we weren't rated on this time, but in the future it could happen, adverse publicity that results in reputational risk. Okay. Now, who's deciding what constitutes
Right.
reputational risk.
And was there a specific issue that they were talking about our reputation
They
being?
didn't provide an example, but let me give you an example.
You could use the liquor laws. You could say, well, there's people in New York that think your liquor laws are weird, and so we're going to actually use that against the state of Utah when it comes to investors
Potentially.
and the interest rates that we'll get.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, well, let me just pause you for a second and get into why people should care about this.
Yes.
So as taxpayers, we're paying for a state project. If we're borrowing for a state project, like a huge road construction
Right.
or a new building on a university campus or something, we may need to borrow money.
Right.
The loan that we get and the interest rate that the state will acquire is based on a certain set of standards. And you're saying that the ESG standards could be used against the state if somebody doesn't agree with us on climate change or on
Right. Or
our liquor laws.
Exactly, or some
any of that
policy that we
stuff.
have.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
So when we go out into the marketplace, even though our credit rating is the top in the world, if you have a separate ESG rating, then investors in the marketplace can point to Utah's ESG rating and say, well, Utah shouldn't be given the lowest rates in the marketplace because of this factor or that factor, or their ESG rating. But
if that's just one company saying that, couldn't we shop ourselves around to a company that isn't using ESG? Or is ESG going to be one of the standards that's going to be required?
The problem is that the three primary credit rating agencies have all signed pledges, climate pledges, that essentially means that they are committed to the ESG agenda.
So it sounds like the climate change is really kind of the driving force behind
exactly,
this.
Yes. And so that then is tied with the social, right? And so you can use the social to kind of.
So it sounds like, given that, and given the fact that we've got a lot of coal and we've got a lot of industries.
There's a lot of ways,
and we've got a lot of drivers here
Yes.
that you could use this, and then our interest rates could be. I mean, I don't know what a high interest rate is for a state.
Well, even if it costs you 20 basis points, right? And I mean, it adds up quickly when you're issuing 100 million or 200 million in debt, right? You just start adding up costs,
Sure.
and those costs can grow over time depending on how many negative ESG factors, right, are written about. So a perfect example, I think, of how subjective and how dangerous this can get is at the end of August when at a BYU volleyball game, women's volleyball game, a fan was accused of using racial slurs.
Right. Against Duke.
Against Duke. And let's say that actually happened, right? In that case, one person in the state is accused of something, and that one bad actor could potentially have an impact on the state because we saw adverse publicity that resulted in reputational risk. A well-known organization said, well, yeah, Utah does have a racist reputation, right? And so suddenly we're being painted with a broad brush, the entire state of Utah, because of one potential bad actor. Right.
And the reason you're putting a question mark on that is that the person who may have said those things hasn't been positively identified.
Right. I mean, I think it's been shown that didn't happen. But I'm saying even in the case that it did happen, right?
Right.
Why is that?
Maybe the standard could be used even if it didn't happen, just based on the talk of the.
Right. No, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I mean, had we been issuing debt at that time, could it have potentially cost us? Right.
So what do you say to banks that I've heard from a number of my friends that work for banks, and I'm not really sure which bank they're working for, but they say that the banks don't like this. They're very, very upset about this. Yeah. Who are those banks, and do we care if they're upset?
They're upset in what way? Just in terms of needing to push ESG, or
they're upset with the state's position against ESG because they believe it's going to hurt them. So my understanding is that it would be larger banks as opposed to the medium or whatever a small bank is
Yeah,
these days.
yeah. I think we saw a very important turning point last week when the bankers were in front of Congress, and Jamie Dimon basically told one of the Congresswomen that, if we go down this road and not provide capital to the fossil fuel industry, that will be a very negative event for this country. And we're already seeing the impact of ESG today with higher inflation because we don't have enough money going into oil and gas today. We're all paying a price for ESG. And it literally isn't, the inflation is partly a result of ESG. So I think the banks are starting to recognize that this is not good for the country and not good for any of us. And if you think about ESG, we're taking things out of a legislative process, questions that should be spoken of and dealt with in those constitutional bodies, legislatures, state legislatures, and Congress. That's where those issues are supposed to be dealt with. But now they're being pushed into the capital markets. And that's why I'm so against this, because it undermines our constitutional form of government.
Okay.
And it also, in order to be successful, the ESG agenda has to capture as much money as it can to think the same way, so that the money doesn't go to a particular industry. In this case, fossil fuels, right? Now, the result is inflation, like I just mentioned, partly a result of that issue. So, as Americans, we have always dealt with these problems in the public square and in our legislative process, and the capital markets have been free to operate. But now the capital markets aren't free. They're not free to adjust in this case because so many large financial institutions have taken the same view and committed to not provide capital. That is, by definition, not a free market.
Right. Interesting. So, I don't know what the current term is for the state of our economy as of right now at the end of September 2022, but it doesn't look like the markets have a very bright future in the near term. So how does the overall economy, perhaps a recession or worse, bode for the priority that ESG type issues will take? Is it going to be dependent on that, do you think?
Well, I think one of the selling points that has been used in the past is that ESG is good for investors. That you will, if you're an investor, you'll do better by
because you can charge
ESG.
you can charge whatever you want for your loan.
So yes, if I'm an investor in the equity markets, right? The story is that I will be better off by investing in companies that have high ESG scores. Now, you look at a country like Sri Lanka that had a very high ESG score. And what happened? Well, as a result of taking nitrogen fertilizer out of their system, they go to organic fertilizer, and it leads to civil unrest because the food production went down significantly, right? So ESG scores don't necessarily lead to better outcomes. In fact, they've led to worse outcomes in some cases. Now, in today's capital markets, oil and gas have been some of the best performing stocks, right, this year and part of last year. And so that story about outperforming and doing better if you have ESG doesn't hold water, right? And so I think that's an important point for investors to understand, that this doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. It's not necessarily tied to the valuation of a firm, and it's not tied into cash flows necessarily. So I think people are starting to understand maybe a little bit better, and that's my hope. And again, it's not about the underlying politics. This mechanism is fundamentally against everything that we as Americans have stood for. This pluralistic institutions that we have, where we divide power in our society among different entities, and because we didn't want a monarchical type of structure here. And ESG substitutes that plurality for centralized control to drive an agenda.
Okay. All right. Very good. Treasurer Oaks, I'm going to cut it short there. You may think that this topic is about as dry as biting off a piece of chalk, but it's very important, and it's something that you're probably going to be hearing a lot about in the future. We're just trying to give you an introduction into the state's view of the ESG issue as legal cases move forward. I'm Rich Pyatt from the Utah Attorney General's Office on behalf of Marlo Oaks. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Legally Speaking.